And just the general question, really, to get you started, Nat, about make the case for differentiating between different types of legislation, constitutional and others, for example.
I think there's a why and there's a how here. The government, in their response to the Lords Constitution Committee's report last year, seemed almost to deny that there was any distinction between constitutional and ordinary legislation. And of course, in terms of current parliamentary process, that comes close to being true. The only distinction is at the decision of government, some first-class constitutional bills have their committee stage on the floor of the House. But at a level of principle, why should, even in the absence of a codified constitution, one treat constitutional bills separately? Well, I suppose the first point is that constitutional legislation and practice is, if you like, the architecture of the state, and the elements of the Constitution are unavoidably interconnected. So an alteration in one part of the building has unforeseen consequences in other parts. And one might think of Mr. Blair's attempt to abolish the office of Lord Chancellor as being the classic illustration of that. So there's an interconnectedness which is not true of other types of legislation, perhaps. The second point would be that some constitutional legislation has an effective presumption of irreversibility, despite any doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament. So Scottish devolution, for example, I think was understood at the time and continues to be understood as something which the Westminster Parliament could not in fact reverse. And thirdly, and this is more recent, the re-emergence of specific structural features in constitutional legislation which we haven't seen for a long time. And these are so-called manner and form restrictions, where a piece of legislation passed by an ordinary majority imposes restrictions on future parliaments about how that legislation is to be implemented or repealed. And the two examples we had last year were the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, with its provision for a supermajority for dissolution under some circumstances, and the referendum lock in the European Union Act. Those are very interesting and potentially difficult mechanisms, and something that you would not find in legislation which is not constitutional. So that's the why. Coming to the how, what legislative standards might one want to impose on constitutional legislation which are different to ordinary legislation, and how might you do that? Well, those different standards, I think, can be divided into two sorts. First of all, enhanced standards, the same sort of standards that you would apply to ordinary legislation, but applied in a stricter way with greater rigour. And the example which the Lords Committee came up with is that an example of that would be the requirement that consultation and pre-legislative scrutiny should not be waived on grounds of alleged urgency if a bill is constitutional. So the idea that the parliamentary voting system and constituencies bill is introduced very quickly at the beginning of the session without any of that preparation is something which would be contrary to these enhanced legislative standards. Then you can think of certain sorts of additional standards which might apply specifically to constitutional legislation. One is that, and this is the proposal of the Lords Constitution Committee, a written ministerial statement should be required for constitutional bills setting out the impact of the proposed legislation on existing constitutional arrangements. And that's addressing this point of interconnectedness. And another one that occurred to us is that referendums on constitutional matters are becoming more common. But there's no agreed principle governing which type of proposed legislation might require or proposal might require a referendum and which might not. So, as we've seen in this Parliament, a change to the voting system, which would be regarded as sub-constitutional in some states, apparently does require a referendum, but a fundamental change in the nature of the upper house, or certainly its composition, apparently does not require a referendum. So a suggestion might be, in the case of that type of major constitutional legislation, that the minister should be required to explain why a referendum is or is not being proposed. And one can think of other examples. The final point is the possibility that if the principle of separate standards for constitutional legislation is accepted, it might be appropriate that those legislative standards are scrutinised by a different committee to the General Legislative Standards Committee. And the argument for doing that is that, as I've tried to indicate, some of this material is specialised. There's a point of interconnectedness. And finally, the general point that the introduction of processes can in itself have a strongly normative effect. So if different committees reviewed standards for constitutional and ordinary legislation, even if in fact they were implying exactly the same standards, all those in the political process would over time be encouraged to behave as if there were a distinct category of constitutional legislation, something which we would very much support.
It's very helpful. Paul, did you want to come in on that at all?
No, not.
Only you.
I think we're now focusing on something that's actually very important. We're talking about earlier we were talking about a government, any government, getting its business. When it comes to constitutional change, am I right in thinking that you're suggesting that that business is of in some ways more serious and more permanent nature than the normal business of government?
Yes, I'd agree with that, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that government ought not to get its way in matters of constitutional change, but it should be harder for them.
Yes.
And it seems curious, I mean, for a long time, up until 1997, there really wasn't much in the way of constitutional legislation, and since then we've had lots and lots of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of that constitutional legislation is piecemeal. A lot of it seems to be designed to address popular dissatisfaction with politics generally in a rather curious way. So the alleged urgency of the Parliamentary Voting Act is explained in terms of popular concern about MPs' expenses by at least one minister, when it seems to me to have really nothing to do with that at all. Yes, I agree with you. These are structural matters which are to do with the rules of the game rather than the game, and the standards should be higher.
Given that I entirely agree with you on those points, if it's accepted that the standards should be higher, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, is there a case for saying that the passing of such legislation should be subject to more than just a simple majority in the House of Commons and indeed the House of Lords?
Well, there certainly is a case for that, and that is what you would find in the great majority of democracies. Not only their constitutions not change very often, but when they do change, there is a supermajority requirement of some type. Now, I might in some future world think that that was desirable, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So I've really focused on things that could realistically be achieved, which would start the ball rolling in the direction of making constitutional change both more coherent and more difficult for individual governments.
could it be said that there is something of a precedent in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, some parts of which do require more than a simple majority to bring about, a simple majority in the House of Commons to bring about a particular end, which would be the dissolution of Parliament?
Yes, I mean, I think in a sense that, well, depending on which side of this debate one's on, I mean, that is at a level of principle a sort of own goal, isn't it? Because it's a concession that under certain circumstances supermajority might be appropriate.
Yep, it is a concession, isn't it? Well, it is beginning to set a precedent. If it's been done once, it can't be argued that it can't be done at all. So that is helpful. I didn't ask if Sir Nicholas or Lord Butler had anything to say on those issues.
I have nothing on this. I think it's admirably put.
What about the actual classification of a matter being constitutional or not? Now, well, I come down again to what we were discussing earlier, namely the conflict between party political activity and parliamentary activity. You can never take the politics out of anything that happens in the Palace of Westminster, and a government will find, or members of government will find a way of putting an argument that suits them at the time. Of course they will. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the very nature of our democratic engagement. So there will be times when it suits a government to say such and such is constitutional legislation, and it could be that the very same issue at another time they would wish to identify as not being constitutional. Do you see a way in which rules could be laid down here? We're straying into the realms of the chairman's favourite subject of a written constitution. I wasn't thinking of that. I was just thinking about this very, very specific issue of identifying constitutional legislation.
Well, I think it is very difficult, and we're at the Constitution Society engaged in an exercise at the moment to see if we can improve on the current definitions that are kicking around. But the essential problem is this, that most of the attempts to define matters or legislation which are constitutional come down to a list of subject matter, and if something is, some proposal is on that list or conforms to that list, it is constitutional, and if it doesn't, it does not. Now, the difficulty with that is that while we can all agree, or think we can agree, that at the core some things are obviously constitutional, there's always a grey area, whereas, as you say, it can be argued either way. And these list-type definitions, and Sir John Baker's is the one that's had the greatest currency recently, end up using words like substantial or significant. So any significant alteration, substantial alteration to whatever it was would be a piece of constitutional legislation. And of course then we're into subjective territory. There are some alternative approaches that you can take, but they don't really do the job because they're too narrow. So, the point I was making earlier, if there is a presumption of irreversibility, I think that most people would agree that that piece of legislation was by its nature constitutional. However, there aren't very many of them, apart from the ones granting independence to colonies and so on, but there really are only about a dozen on the statute book, so that's too narrow to be helpful. So in the end, coming to the point, someone has to decide. There is not an absolutely objective definition against which one can test whether something is a constitutional or even a major constitutional importance, and everyone will agree. And one of the purposes, secondary purposes, but behind my proposal that legislative standards for constitutional legislation should be handled by a different committee, is that the effect of that is to suck that decision away from the executive and back to Parliament, because without knowing what the detailed mechanism might be, those two committees would have to divide the territory between them in some way, and would thus effectively be making the decision about what did and did not fall within that constitutional definition.
Thank you.
Question of the piecemeal nature.
Paul.
Suggested. I mean, is there really, can you really see any mechanism that will stop that? I mean, having seen how legislation is formed on devolution in this place, which was usually the result of horse trading within the government party itself, leading through devolution to Devo Max, and then ended up in the holy grail of independence. The process is on that slippery slope. It will be done. As politics, the political opinion changes. I mean, is anything you think you could take which will avoid it being done on a basis of a single act going through that's not related to what's likely to happen in the future or what's happening in other parts of the United Kingdom?
Well, I think as things stand, all one can hope to do is to change the culture to make it more embarrassing for government to introduce major constitutional changes in a piecemeal or thoughtless or self-interested way. In terms of formal processes, short of a wholesale constitutional revision and in effect a codified written constitution, I don't see any formal way that you can prevent government introducing bills which are of a constitutional nature, and if those bills happen to be piecemeal, well, there is no structure to prevent it.
I mean, there might be another reason for being optimistic at the moment, and that's the weakening of the dependence that so many MPs and party leaders have on the popular press with the collapse of the influence of the Murdoch party, certainly the decline of the influence of the Murdoch press. In the bills that are regarded as being the worst piece of legislation, the Dangerous Dogs Act, that was a result of a campaign by tabloids. The 90 days was put forward and supported by the Sun newspaper, who excoriated those brave independent MPs who opposed it, many from the Labour Party, and stopped it happening. Another piece of, but they were criticised as being friends of terrorists, just as the opponents of the Dangerous Dogs Act were described as people who were in favour of children being mauled by dogs. But that's that happens to be the system here. But again, we've just had an extraordinary by-election in which a man was elected on a cause that no party supports, no main party supports, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, and a refusal to even discuss it. Whereas
just before
anyway,
just before Nat comes back on that, I think Robin, you need to leave us. I understand by.
Well, by 11 o'clock, but I have the Intelligence and Security Committee, but no, I mean, I don't want to be discourteous.
No, not at all. On the contrary, we really appreciate you taking the extra time to stay, but please feel free to attend to important matters of state, indeed. Thank you so much for coming on this morning. We'll carry on with our remaining 2 witnesses.
If I can bring this along and discuss.
Yes, if you would. If you can bring it to a question, Paul, that would be
so it's just a train of thought. I'm writing a book at the moment, in fact, about the long story about this.
No, we don't want the long story.
We'd
like a question, Paul, please.
Yeah, the thing isn't the change of culture we need, is the elevation of the value of independent backbenchers to be recognised.
Well, I agree with that. And going to your point about the press, the media, I think it's tongue-in-cheek, actually rather a good thing in one way that the press take rather a limited interest in constitutional matters, because it does at least have the effect of removing some of those pressures from you're talking about from government. Although not in all cases, and the whole question of the Scottish referendum, which is going to be the looming question of the next couple of years, is one that the popular press is going to become seriously exercised about. I mean, our experience trying to provide, if you like, public education on constitutional matters over the last 2 or 3 years is that there is frankly very little public interest in a lot of this territory, and that's borne out by various polls, and people are asked to put various things in order of priority. So I do think, given government's natural tendency to want to legislate and make their mark and change things for good or bad reasons, it does very much come down to Parliament to do what it can about this. And yeah, I'm a great believer in the idea that behaviour is changed by small changes in structure and relationship, and by putting small building blocks in place which cause people to think twice about constitutional tinkering. The cumulative effect of that over time is quite valuable.
Okay, I want to get back on to Legislative Standards Committee, if I may. And maybe, Nick, should it be a bicameral Legislative Standards Committee?
Well, we didn't want to give a strong hint on that. I mean, I think that would be the simplest thing to do, right. And that is what the Lords Leaders Group has recommended. But I mean, I think it's an entirely sort of question for Parliament, and I know this is all sensitive, so if there are two, that's okay. I mean, by us. So I think it's not our...
Right. And where exactly in the legislative timetable do you think it would be at its optimum value?
Before the second reading is what we want to envisage. But I mean, again, that's a...
so at that point you'd be able to call ministers in to make some observations on the preparation of the bill?
Well, I think we envisage that it would be only a one-session meeting of the... Right. Because you don't want to make it political, basically. And so it's just a question of going through the standards and saying whether they're there or not, possibly with a paper from some people from the scrutiny unit, if there were such, if there were resources for that. But they've said they could do it if there were resources. And then the decision would be either a report saying this is okay, and the document provided by the government explains why they have not done something, but they've done most of it, or something like that. Otherwise, it would say this does need either more work, or I mean, so the choice for the government would be either to do more work, which would be a delay, or bullying the thing through and overruling the recommendation of the Legislative Standards Committee. And that would be a loss of face as well as delay. So we imagine that would come into play in practice very, very rarely, because we hope that agreeing on the standards would actually affect the behaviour, as we've said, and improve the quality.
So the sanction is really a name and shame as an ultimate.
Plus a bit of loss of parliamentary time.
Yeah.
But yes, basically.
I mean, some of us have held that select committee reports themselves, if you had the ability to put them on the floor in a more rigorous way than we can at the moment, would engage select committees in a process of negotiation with government, because you would argue, well, look, if you can give us the nod on 4 of our recommendations, the other 3 perhaps we will downplay, and then you immediately get Parliament and the government into a process of interaction, which I think ultimately would be a very productive way forward.
Yes, well, I agree.
And just to give you the opportunity to answer the arguments that really what we're doing is, because legislative scrutiny is so poor, we're trying to find other ways to handle this. So we invent pre-legislative scrutiny, because legislative scrutiny isn't very good. We invent post-legislative scrutiny. And are we answering the fundamental problem, or just bolting on another bit of mechanism and avoiding the fundamental problem that legislative scrutiny itself is inadequate? And that is what needs addressing, rather than, as some would argue, introducing the Legislative Standards Committee.
Well, I think I noticed your earlier witnesses said that very often scrutiny was actually quite effective, and very effective. So I don't think we are starting from there, but what we are starting from is the proposition also put forward by earlier witnesses, that if a bill reaches Parliament in a bad state, there is a limit to how much change you can actually bring about in Parliament. And if it's fundamentally flawed, you can't actually do that in Parliament. And so we're trying to say, I think one of your questioners said that the core business of the Parliament is to stop bad legislation. And we're trying to reduce the number of cases of that, and also give a place where your supporters club chairman, as you used the term, can get together and are free and they can act effectively.
Yeah. I think there was disbelief on both sides with the previous witnesses when they felt they were given a hard time by Parliament. And I think a number of us on this side of the table felt very rarely do we get the opportunity to use our expertise, not to give people a hard time, but to genuinely probe and make sure the legislation is better, which many of us think is one of the core functions of our jobs as members of Parliament. So there's a little bit of a miss, I think, those witnesses who said that.
Well, I think there is there is the time question, and I think that is highly relevant to bringing in the expertise of MPs. And I could say something else about time, if you liked.
By all means.
Well, I think we take the line that a key feature of an agreement, which we've always envisaged between Parliament and the Executive, would be that the Executive would not have a legislative programme which was just too big for it to be possible for adequate scrutiny to be provided by Parliament. And that's a sort of precondition for the whole thing. And I think it's quite an important, it's not detailed about rules, but that is important. And I think that is another thing which, as I understand it, the present leader agrees with.
I think it's one of those things that where there's a will, there's a way. If there is in fact goodwill, and that's why I think I return to this question of having a very clear political declaration from number 10, really, if this is to work. And I would go back to the concept of timetabling. When timetabling was invented, it was genuinely an attempt to cut out this nonsense of people talking on one amendment for days at a time and actually get proper discussion. And if I may just be allowed a brief reminiscence from the Whip's office, I remember one of the first bills that I was in charge of going to see Sir Alan Hazelhurst with my opposite number from the opposition party. And we sat down and we went through very, very carefully what we felt were the key issues. I wanted government to get its bill. The opposition wanted key debates given adequate time. Sir Alan refereed in a very, very impartial way, and we agreed a timetable motion that everybody was very happy with. Now, if you want to do it on that way, you get better legislation. If you want to use your massive majority to sledgehammer something through, you can make even the best concept useless and irrelevant by abusing the power of the majority. So I think, again, I'm feeling my way back really for members to think about this, that unless the people at the very top say we want this to work, there'll always be mechanisms of stopping it from working. Ellen, I know you've got one final one. And, Paul, did you want to come back?
Very brief one.
Undoubtedly true, and of course the time to which the chairman is referring was, I think, when timetable motions were not automatic but had to be justified by the minister to Parliament as a whole. And because they had to be justified, then the minister had to speak to them. Now the minister speaks for about 2 minutes, and that's the end of it. It is assumed that there will be a timetable motion, and there surely can be no doubt that that's a curtailment of democracy. It's not for me to make points but to ask questions. If the Legislative Standards Committee, which many of us support and think would be an excellent idea and an improvement to our legislative process, if it were not to be accepted by government or not brought in, is there a halfway house whereby the purpose of the Legislative Standards Committee and the statement of compliance, etc., could in some way be incorporated in the work of pre-legislative scrutiny as it currently stands?
Well, I think it could be, and at the moment on the Legislative Standards Committee, I mean, our feeling is that the first thing to do is to agree the standards. It's not really very much point in arguing about whether you do or don't want a Legislative Standards Committee, unless there is a text for the government to respond to say either we think this is right or explain why they favour something else. I mean, it is an extraordinary lacuna at the moment that there is no agreement about standards between the executive and the Parliament. It seems that very odd. But I think it would be possible, to answer your specific question, for when a draft bill comes in for pre-leg scrutiny, it would be possible to do the same thing as we've described at that point, and for that to be taken into account. And possibly when the bill comes back the next time, you might just want to revisit it,
Yes.
the Legislative Standards Committee, but it might be a good way of dealing with that. But I think the prime thing from our point of view is that there is a text of, there is agreed standards, or at least government-supported standards, but hopefully agreed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did you want
Just briefly
brief question?
to recall the torment of Yesarek 4th, 3 o'clock in the morning, but the Cardiff Bay barrage builder that straddled 3 parliaments, and I vividly recall inventing a mythical creature called the barking Grangetown rat to a house that was exhausted or inebriated at 3:30 in the morning when we'd reached Amendment 5 of 250 amendments but done by Rodri Morgan. I think we, looking back on that and knowing the faults of any change you make, I mean, I hope that if we are working together, which I very much hope we will on this, that we will be conscious of the fact that by introducing new reforms, we don't introduce new weaknesses as well. I think that's the difficulty when you swing, the pendulum swings from one abuse of the House that we end up in something that might be an absurdity at the other end. I just want to thank everyone for the evidence this morning, and I hope that this can be a way forward for all of us.
Any comments?
Now, I think I've made the points that I would have made.
Excellent. Nothing that you want to put on the record that we've missed. Got the opportunity to write to us as well, and I really would appreciate keeping the dialogue going. I think we really need to be exact about how we get this done, and we need also to get that political side nailed down, and make sure that government feels that it can still get its business while treating us respectfully as a partner that can contribute to legislation. Nick, Nat, and Robin in his absence. I thought at one point we had the football system where the armband would be passed to Chris, who would leap out the dugout and come to the table. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.